If you got your Bibles, and I hope you do, turn with me to the book of Philippians. Philippians is where we're going to be this morning. In case you haven't been with us for the last few weeks, we've just been walking through the book of Philippians, just studying this little book that was written to the church of Philippi, letting us kind of observe what they were going through, the strengths and weaknesses of this church, all those kinds of things. And so we are making our way through the rest of chapter 2 this morning. And as you're turning there, let me tell you a little game that the staff and I like to play from time to time. It's not often, but from time to time. We like to play a game called Has Jason Seen This Movie? And the reason is we like to play this game is because I'm not a movie guy. I don't just enjoy going and sitting and watching movies on end. I don't know if you know that I fidget a lot, and so I move, and so if I'm sitting down, I'm up. Even during staff meeting and stuff, I just have to get up and move. I just don't sit well, and so movies are especially a movie theater is my worst nightmare. So we play this game, Has Jason Seen This Movie? And most of the time, the movies that I say yes to are a handful. It's usually either a Disney movie, the new Paw Patrol movie, those are pretty much it. Anything that's rated G and under, just the age of my kids. And so if I sit down and turn something on, one of them walks in, it's well, turn that off, I think I was Batman Begins or something was on the other day, and one of my kid walks in, and I was whoop, turn that, And so it's just a stage of life that I'm in, and so I don't get to watch a whole lot of movies. But one of the things that I do enjoy about movies when I get the opportunity, it's maybe a sports movie or maybe this epic battle type movie, war type movie, is there's usually this scene that happens, and it's when the chips are down or maybe you're losing just a little bit, and they all have this scene, and it's movies like Remember the Titans or Rudy or Hoosiers or Miracle, Friday Night Lights, they have this, they kind of all come in, and then they, the coach or the leader, or whoever it is, it's leading them out to battle, they do this, there's this epic scene where they give them this charge. And usually, in the movie, there's the music starts playing, and you're on the edge of your seat, and you start getting I wish I was there playing, I want to be in the game, and everybody's yes, and everybody gets excited, and then they start clapping, and then they start standing, and then they run out. If it's a sportsman, they run out of the locker room. If it's an epic battle, they're charging the enemy. There's something that happens, and again, it's just that time where it's the halftime speech, and let's go. They're all charged up, and everybody's excited. But I always wonder, because the movie always shows it as they go out and they win the game. But what happens, I always wonder, okay, what happens after that adrenaline is worn off? What happens after the rah-rah speech? What happens in that moment? And I feel we're in that space a little bit as we close out Philippians chapter 2 this morning, because Paul has just given this epic charge, right? This Christ hymn of verses 6 through 11 in Philippians of chapter 2. And I'm sure as he was given this epic speech, this Christ hymn, that there were cheers of yes, every knee's gonna bow and every tongue confess that Jesus, and there is all this going on. But I wonder what happens next? How do you follow that? What transpires? And here's what you don't do. You don't just close out that train of thought and move on to something else. You don't just move on. You make connections with what has just been said. Paul's going to give us some logical next steps as we just had this most poetic of hymns, Christocentric hymn. Paul's going to give us some connection points. He's really going to bring out two major connections that he wants us to not forget as we move in and close out chapter 2. So in light of everything that he has said so far, he's essentially going to go, hey, every knee's going to bow and every tongue's going to confess, therefore, because that's the very first word of verse 12. So every knee's going to bow, every tongue's going to confess, therefore, let's live in that light, knowing that on the last day, we're going to have to give an account. Or maybe Christ was vindicated for his humble life that we looked at last week. Therefore, what he's going to say, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So it's this epic scene that's happening, but I don't want us to just close out and go, yes, let's move on. It's yes, there's more for us to learn. There's more for us to understand. But before we jump in and unpack too much, I want to read the first few verses in our text this morning. So again, I hope you're there. Philippians chapter 2. I want to pick it up in verse 12. Paul says this. He says, therefore, my dear friends, Just as you have always obeyed, so now, not only in my presence, but even more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is working in you both to will and to work according to his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may be blameless and pure, children of God who are faultless in a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you shine like stars in the world by holding firm to the word of life. Then I can boast in the day of Christ that I didn't run or labor for nothing, but even if I am poured out as a drink offering on the sacrificial service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. In the same way, you should also be glad and rejoice with me. Okay, so to start off, let me just make sure we have something clear, because through our text this morning, like there's a little bit of tension in what Paul is saying. And you may not notice it at first, but if you start studying, like there's a little bit of tension in this idea, and theologians kind of call it like divine sovereignty and human responsibility. And often they're pitted against each other as if it's an either or. But I think if we look at the text this morning, it's not going to be an either or, but a both and. And that Paul is trying to bring out this idea of divine sovereignty, but he also wants to draw out this idea of human responsibility. So let me just, like he says, work out your salvation. Now, you could read that. You could read that as Paul's saying like something like, you need to work to acquire your salvation, or you need to work to earn your salvation. But we know that that's not what Paul's saying, because that's not what he said elsewhere. He said that salvation is a gift, that you can do nothing to earn that gift. So it can't be that he's trying to make that case, nor does it say, well, you've already earned your salvation, now your perseverance depends entirely upon you. Or maybe he doesn't say, well, listen, you've already earned, the salvation's there, so just go and relax, don't care nothing else about how you live. It doesn't really matter, it's already been done, so just go live how you want to live. He doesn't say either one of those things. And so there's like this tension of divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Paul says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And in doing so, he makes two like connecting clauses, or two dependent clauses. He says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. One, as you've always obeyed. And two, not only in my presence, but even more in my absence. Remember, Paul has a very close relationship with his church. This isn't a group of people that he's writing to that he doesn't know. This is a group of people that he has like intimate knowledge of who they are. And so as he's writing this, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, he's essentially giving them an encouragement and a challenge. The encouragement is this, that everything in culture is pushing against you living for Jesus. That everything in culture is going against you trying to obey and follow Jesus. But he says, yet you have always obeyed. Even as you have obeyed. Let's continue to do that. So he's encouraging, saying, listen, I've heard about you. I've read stories about you. I've seen your life up close and personal, but I've also heard about how you're living. Let's continue doing that. You have always obeyed. Here's my encouragement. You've always obeyed Jesus. Like, I'm so encouraged by that. Let's keep that. But then here's the challenge. It doesn't matter your circumstance. Continue doing that. It doesn't matter if I'm here, if I'm present with you, or absent. It doesn't matter who's around. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that sometimes it's easy for us, if we're not careful, to change the way that we live depending on who we're around. We act one way at work, and we act another way when we're with our church friends. We act one way when we're out playing sports or competitive or intramural or whatever. You're playing a league, the city league, and then the way that we respond afterwards. Like we said, it doesn't matter who we're around, that we should respond and we should act the same way. And Paul's trying to say again, like, listen, whether I'm with you or I'm absent, I want you to live for Jesus. I want you to obey Jesus. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, that makes sense, but what about the first part of the verse? What does the work out your salvation with fear and trembling mean? Like, okay, I get it. He's encouraging them, he's challenging them, but what does that part mean? Okay, we've already said that it cannot mean that you're trying to acquire something, you're trying to work for something. We know that, but he's trying to remind the church here that they also can't be passive in their Christian journey. So the simple answer, we're going to talk more about it, but the simple answer of what it means to work out your salvation with fear and trembling is to follow the example of Jesus. In its most basic form, in its most simplest form, follow the example of Jesus. Just a few verses earlier, Paul laid out for us who Jesus is: a humble servant, obedient to the point of death, puts others' interest above his own. As Christ followers, we want to emulate that. We want to emulate Jesus. There's no shortcut to Christian maturity. So if we want to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, we want to do that. Now, fear and trembling, I don't know about you, but when I hear those words, like fear, often like we think of like scared movies, like being afraid or being fearful of something. But maybe a better translation would be something like wonder or awe, amazement. So work out our salvation with a wonder or awe. Like we're entering into the Christmas season. I don't know about you guys. When I was younger, I was a Scrooge when it came to Christmas. Like, there was nothing fun about it. I was the kid that, like, parents would be like, let's take a family picture, and I would try to ruin every picture possible. It was like a game to me. And so, like, in Christmas lights, my family would be like, hey, do you want to go decorate? No. Why would anybody want to? But as I got older and kids, like, there is, again, I don't want to take this too far, but there's something about, like, this time of year where there's like a wonder, there's like a sense of like newness and anticipation. And I think that's what he's trying to get at with when it comes to fear, is like a wonder, like an awe, like just being amazed. And then when it comes to trembling, he's not necessarily talking about just like shaking, although that is a part of the allness of God. Like when Moses came into the presence of God, like he couldn't even look, he fell down. So there is like an aspect of trembling, but maybe a better word would be like submission. So we work on our salvation with wonder and submission. This is what he's trying to get at. And just one more thing for me to point out with just this verse. I don't know what translation you have, and so just maybe a translation note here. The CSV, which is the translation I use, or the ESV, it says, work out your own salvation. This isn't a bad translation. It's not that it's not there in the text, but I think in our culture today, we live in such an individualistic culture that we can often think, well, I work out my salvation, and that's just between me and Jesus. You work out your salvation, that's just between you and Jesus. And actually, the word own there, like work out your own, is a part of another word, the word that like precedes it, that is a plural word. So really, like the NIV translates it, continue to work out your salvation. And I think the reason why I just want to point this out and for us to keep this in mind is, yes, there is an aspect of salvation that is individual, but it cannot be separated from the local church. It's always done in community. It's not just Jesus and me, it's Jesus and we. And so I just want to make that point too as we move on. So Paul's trying to communicate, work out your own salvation in the community found in the local church. And then we can do this, he's going to say, because God is at work in us. Look at verse 13. He said, for it is God who is working in you both to will and to work according to his good purpose. You see, for Paul, any human obedience, goodness, righteousness, joy, or love has at its roots the goodness, righteousness, joy, and love of God. Meaning you can't do it without him. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, then what's the point? Like, if I can't do it without him, if it's all him anyways, like what is the point? Like, you may almost be a little bit discouraged by it. You could almost see it like as a disincentive. And D.A. Carson, famous theologian, he says it this way. He says, this passage, verse 13, is far from being a discouraging passage or a disincentive to press on. Paul insists that this is actually an incentive. He says this, he says, assured as we are that God works in this way in his people, we should be all the more strongly resolved to will and to act in a way that pleases the King. That pleases the King. The incentive is this, that God is at work at the deepest levels of who you are. Even when you don't think that he's working, even when you can't see, even when you can't, quote unquote, feel him, he's there. Working in your life. We work because God first started working in us. And he's bringing about our salvation to completion, which should bring comfort to us knowing that you're never alone. Never. That God is always with you. But here's what Paul knows. Paul knows that you might still be a little bit confused, or you might still not completely understand. And so when he talks about working out your salvation with fear and trembling, what he's going to do next is he's going to give us some specific examples. Like, he's going to get really specific with us. Yes, it means to live like Jesus, but what type of attitude should you adopt? All right, so here's what he's going to say. The first thing is this: how do you work out your salvation with fear and trembling? If you want to get really specific, live like Jesus, yes, but here's what he's going to say. Do everything without complaining or arguing. Or your text may say grumbling or arguing. We just don't use the word grumble anymore. Like I never say to my kids, stop grumbling. They would be like, what? So we say, stop complaining, right? Now this sounds like, doesn't this sound like something you would say to kids? Like do something without complaining or arguing. Like it sounds like that, right? Go play downstairs and please do so without complaining or arguing. Or hey, we're going to sit at the dinner table, and if I hear any complaining or arguing for any of you, you're going to your room after dinner. Or if you would just stop complaining or arguing with your brother or sister, they would leave you alone, right? It kind of sounds like something that you would say to your kids. Why in the world would Paul say this to us? Work out your own salvation without complaining or arguing. Because even as adults, we need to hear this. Because even as adults, our natural bent, our natural lean is to complain or argue. Just think about it. See, sometimes it's because life has taken an unexpected turn, like something that's happened outside of your control. And in those moments, Christian perseverance is difficult, pursuing holiness is hard, giving generously takes a back seat. And in our grieving, yes, it's completely fine to grieve in those moments, but in our grieving, if we're not careful, the enemy will slowly infiltrate and get us to the point of complaining or arguing. Get us to take our eyes off of Jesus and start having that woe is me conversation. Nothing goes right for me. Always a mess, right? Or sometimes it's because things just don't go the way that we want them. And people aren't responding the way that you want them to respond. And when people don't respond the way that we want them to respond, our natural bent is to complain or arguing. How do they not see things from our perspective? How do they not see things the way that I see things? It's so clear, it's so obvious, right? How could they not? And if we're not careful, we feel justified to complain or argue. Or sometimes it's because we just go with the crowd. Like sometimes we don't even know why we're complaining or why we're arguing. We just go ahead, even when we're not exactly sure. We live in a world where the natural tendency for all of us, if we're not careful, is to complain or argue. So what do you do when it comes? Like not if, but when. When the temptation arises for you to lean in and start to grumble, to start to complain, to start to argue, what do you do? Do you remember the awe and wonder? If anyone had any reason to complain, wouldn't it be Jesus? I've lived a perfect life and I'm the one that has to die. Like, wouldn't it be him? So when that temptation comes to complain or to argue, do you remember who he is? Do you remember the awness, the wonder, the submission to the one who brings salvation? And just in case you're going like, well, I don't know, Paul's going to take it one step more. And I love this. He's going to give us a reason why not to complain or argue, and then he's going to give us a way to battle the temptation. Look at verse 15. Here's the reason not to complain. So that you may be blameless and pure, children of God who are faultless in a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you shine like stars in the world by holding firm to the word of life. So the reason to not complain or to not argue is so that you can shine like stars in the world around you, which can only happen if you are blameless and pure, faultless in a crooked and perverted generation. So one of the things that sets Christians apart from the rest of the world is that the way that we respond when things don't go our way is not like everyone else. Like that you and I, as believers in Jesus, like we point others to him and not to ourselves and not to maybe the horrible situation that we're in. It's the very same thing with the Old Testament. If you look at the people of God in the Old Testament, like they were to shine a light to the watching world, that they were ruled by one God, Yahweh. And so you and I are the very same way. We're supposed to point people to Jesus by the way that we live our lives. The question that I have for us is the way that you live your life, the way that you respond when things don't go the way that you want to respond, would it be different than the rest of the world, or would it look the exact same? What would it look like? Like, to shine like stars in the world means that we look different than the world. right? We look different. And the way that you battle this is to hold firm to the word of life. I guess the only way I know to battle it. There's a series that we do with our college students in Salt Company. Pretty much every fall, we do like a relationship series. We'll talk about like dating relationships and how do you date with a Christian worldview. And we talk about singleness, like how to be single and how do you live for Jesus in the midst of that. And one of the other things we will often do is we'll give a talk on like friendship, relationships from that capacity. Like what does it look like to friends? And one of the things that we say is that you're the sum total of your 5 closest friends. Meaning that if I were to take you out of the equation and I just looked at your 5 closest friends, if I observed them, the music that they listen to, the way that they talk to other people, the way that they treat other people, the way that they tip after lunch or after dinner, like all those things, like it could give us an indication or a taste of who you are. The reality is not just our college students need that. I think we need it as adults as well. But one of the relationships that we often forget that makes up really who we are is our relationship with Jesus. See, I think most of us would say, like, I want to look more like Jesus. Like, I want to look more and more like him. But then if I ask, like, okay, how much are you actually spending with him? So many of us would go, man, it's been a little while. Like, I prayed today. My prayer's great. But when's the last time you got in the Word? Like, when's the last time you surrounded yourself and just spent dedicated time reading his word, getting to know him better? I find that we want to be more like him, but oftentimes we don't want to spend time with him. This works in no other relationship that we have, yet we think it'll work with Jesus. So you want to know how to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, stop complaining or arguing. And the reason why we want to stop complaining or arguing is so that we can be blameless and faultless to the watching world. And the way that we do that is by spending time in the Word of life. Spending time with Jesus. So that's the first. That's the first thing we need to understand, to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, no complaining or arguing. Here's the second thing he's going to say. Not only do we want to complain or argue, number 2, we want to emulate the right Christian leaders. Look back at the text. Paul says this. He says, then I can boast in the day of Christ that I didn't run or labor for nothing. So Paul isn't out for his own name. He's out for boasting in the name of Jesus. But he doesn't just leave us there. He doesn't just say, like emulate me. He's also going to give us a couple of more examples. And so if you'll kind of like go down to verse 19, he's going to give us 2 more examples to look up to. In verse 19, he says this. He says, now I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be encouraged by news about you. For I have no one else like-minded who will genuinely care about your interest. All seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know his proven character, because he has served with me in gospel ministry like a son with the Father. Therefore, I hope to send him as soon as I see how things go with me. I am confident in the Lord that I myself will also come soon. So the first one is Timothy. But then he continues and says, but I consider it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, my co-worker and fellow soldier, as well as your messenger and minister to my need, since he has been longing for all of you and was distressed because you heard that he was sick. Indeed, he was so sick that he nearly died. However, God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me, so that I would not have to have sorrow upon sorrow. For this reason, I am very eager to send him, so that you may rejoice again when you see him, and I may be less anxious. Therefore, welcome him in the Lord with great joy, and hold people like him in honor, because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up what was lacking in your ministry to me. You want to know how to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. You want to surround yourself with people who emulate Jesus. And Paul has just given us 3 examples. He's pointed to himself and said, hey, listen, I'm out for you as a church. I'm out for Jesus. And he pointed to Timothy. He pointed to Epaphroditus. Who's the person that you have in your life that's going to encourage you, that's maybe going to challenge you when you start complaining or arguing, can say with love, stop it. Who are those people in your life? Who do you surround yourself with that allows you to be less anxious? Just like Paul said about Epaphroditus. These people are rare. Like these types of people are rare. For many of us, the people that we hang around are the people when the conversation turns, we start to gossip or we start to complain, and we disguise it. We disguise it. Because I think if I were to ask us, like, man, who would consider themselves complainers or arguers? You'd be like, not me. I'm just a go with the flow kind of person. Maybe not. Maybe not as much as you think you are. So who are those people that you surround yourself with? Because here's how we disguise it. We disguise it with something like we start complaining or arguing. I'm just joking. But I'm not, that's not really true. Like, I'm just joking. Well, there's usually a little bit of truth there. Or we'll disguise it with like, man, I'm just trying to be honest. I'm just trying to tell the truth. Who are the people in your life that you can surround yourself with that point you to Jesus? That make you more like him? Listen, and there are people in this church that I would go, man, you need to surround yourself with them because they're going to point you to the Almighty God. They're not the one that's going to make you turn to gossip. They're not the ones that's going to turn to complaining or arguing. They're the one that's going to point you to Jesus. Do you have those people in your life? And then let's take it a step further. Are you intentional about spending time with them? Are you intentional about spending time with them? Don't always wait to let them ask you to do something. Maybe, just maybe, you need to take the initiative and go, listen, man, I would love to meet up. Like, if you got time like every other week, man, I would love to meet up. Or when you're thinking about what you're going to do on Friday night, maybe you need to start inviting those people who can point us to Jesus. So, to work at our salvation with fear and trembling, we don't want to complain or argue. He says, man, you need to emulate the right Christian leaders. And then third, he's going to say this, have the right perspective. Look at verse 17. He says, but even if I am poured out as a drink offering on the sacrificial service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. In the same way, you should also rejoice. You should also be glad and rejoice with me. You see, Paul's focus is on the faithfulness of this little church plant, not on himself or his current situation. In the current situation that he's in, if you'll remember, he's writing this from prison in Rome. And he's not thinking about himself, he's thinking about this little church. He has the right perspective. Yes, he's in prison. Yes, he's suffering. But his perspective is all about making Jesus famous. He can rejoice because it's not about him, it's about them. Maybe let me ask a couple of questions for us. Like, would you put the health of Radiant Church above your own? Like above your own interest? Like Paul, I mean, again, he's writing this in prison. Like, I mean, you got to think that it's going through his mind, like, I would love to just be out of this prison. See, oftentimes when we're walking through difficult situations, we can act as if we're the only one who has ever walked in that situation, when in reality, there's other people who have walked through more difficult situations than you. And Paul's here going, man, it's not about me. I can rejoice in the fact that, I mean, I know I'm in prison, but I can rejoice because this little church over here in Philippi, and they're living the way that I discipled them to live. They're living the way that we've encouraged them to live. When you have the right perspective and things don't go your way, you don't complain or arguing. You allow God to work in you. You allow God to work through you. You allow God to use you to remind you of the salvation that can be found in him and him alone. I wonder if Paul could say this very same thing about us. That's the question I've been asking myself this week a lot, is could Paul have written this to me? Like, would he be able to say this about me? What would he be able to encourage me in? You see, if you have this type of perspective, it allows you to have contagious joy, because nothing can get you down. Your joyfulness is not determined by the situation that you find yourself in. You see, we don't drift towards joy. We often drift the other way. We often drift towards being ones that complain or argue. Paul says, work out your salvation, not by complaining, surrounding yourself with people who are going to point you in the right direction, point you to Jesus, and have the right perspective. This is what leads to a joy-filled life. So I think the question before us this morning is, are we working out our salvation with fear and trembling? Or are we trying to do things on our own? Are we trying to do things our way? I think a lot of times we look at things and we always think the grass is always greener somewhere else. And the reality is the grass isn't greener somewhere else, because the things that you're struggling with now are still going to be there when you go to that other place. I think Paul wants to look at us and say, remember what Jesus did. Never get over the cross. Never get over the resurrection. Fear, awe, wonder, trembling, submission to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Let's pray.